Welcome to the celebration of World Philosophy Day at Kutztown University. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, otherwise known as UNESCO, celebrates Philosophy Day every year on the third Thursday in November. In the words of UNESCO, philosophy offers a cross-cutting reflection and analysis that should permeate all disciplines which aim to build a better understanding of our present world and develop adequate responses to challenges. Philosophers have a very important role in shedding light on contemporary challenges, especially when these relate to ethics and justice. UNESCO believes that critical thinking, foresight, and ethical judgment are invaluable ingredients for a healthy society. In the words of UNESCO, UNESCO leads World Philosophy Day, but does not own it. It belongs to everyone, everywhere who cares about philosophy. At Kutztown University, the Department of Philosophy has chosen to celebrate World Philosophy Day with a lecture by an individual of significant renown. Today, we hold the second annual lecture, and in the words of the organizers, we aim at celebrating philosophical thinking as a vehicle for promoting peace and harmony among nations, cultures, and peoples of the world. The purpose is to link philosophical wisdom and knowledge with promotion of local and global justice and to enhance awareness of our responsibilities towards the human family. I am personally grateful to all of you for joining us tonight to take part in this celebration. And in particular, I welcome Dr. Pogge, our speaker tonight, to Kutztown University. I would now like to invite Dr. Ashraf Adeel, a faculty member in the philosophy department who has played a leading role in promoting and implementing this initiative on our campus, to formally introduce the speaker and the topic of this annual lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vargas, and welcome Dr. Pogge and everyone in the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, Department of Philosophy is very proud to present Dr. Pogge for our second annual lecture on World Philosophy Day. Dr. Pogge is currently the director of the Global Justice Program and Leitner Professor of Philosophy and International Affairs at Yale University. He is also the research director of the Center for the Study of the Mind and Nature at the University of Oslo, a professorial research fellow at the Center for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at the Australian National University, and professor of political philosophy at the University of Central Lancashire's Center for Professional Ethics. In addition, he is an editor for social and political philosophy for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and a member of the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters. Dr. Pogge received his PhD from Harvard University with a dissertation supervised by the famous American philosopher John Rawls. Since then, he has published widely on Kant and in moral and political philosophy, including various books on John Rawls and global justice. Dr. Pogge's World Poverty and Human Rights is one of the most prominent and controversial books in contemporary political philosophy. It includes a number of original and substantial theses, the most notable being that the people in wealthy Western liberal democracies are currently harming the world poor and contributing towards increasing their poverty, severe poverty. In the Health Impact Fund, Making New Medicines Accessible for All, Dr. Pogge and his co-author argue in favor of establishing the Health Impact Fund, HIF. The HIF is a new proposal for stimulating research and development of life-saving pharmaceuticals that make substantial reductions in the global burden of disease. Dr. Pogge will talk today about world poverty, explorations and responsibilities, a topic that falls at the center of his seminal work on global justice. Through his books and articles on severe world poverty and human rights, Dr. Pogge has caused a paradigm shift in our outlook on this critical subject. After his speech, there shall be a Q&A session, and that session will be conducted by our colleague, Chair of Philosophy Department, Dr. John Liza. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Pogge.
So let me try, is the mic working? Yes. Great. Good, so thank you very much for these two really great introductions. And I want to start by talking a little bit about the other half. There is, we already talked about how philosophy can potentially contribute something to real world politics, to the problems that the world is facing these days. But I think it's also important to say, especially on World Philosophy Day, that there's something intrinsically important for philosophy in being involved in these matters. So philosophy, as you all know, comes from the Greek, and it means love of wisdom. And when you ask yourself what really wisdom is, I think a good answer is wisdom is knowing what matters. And what matters is in part determined by what is morally important. That's a very important part of what matters. And this is how at least I got through philosophy into the problems of politics, world poverty, global health, and so forth that I'm now spending a good bit of my time dealing with. So this talk is, and that was by request of the organizers, is going to be about world poverty, a problem that I think matters as much as any. And I will tell you a little bit about what the problem is, what possible solutions are, possible explanations, and then I hope we can have a little discussion at the end. So now is this working? I think I'm good with this. No, it should. It's not yet working, sorry. Let's use the, yes. Yeah, got it. So first thing is that a few facts and figures about the world poverty problem, so you know what we are talking about. Poverty is sort of a broad phenomenon, various kinds of deprivations related to insufficient income. We're about 7 billion human beings on this planet now, and of these 7 billion, very large numbers suffer from very severe often life-threatening deprivations, such as that they don't have enough to eat, that they don't have access to essential medicines, lack safe drinking water, lack adequate shelter, have no electricity, lack adequate sanitation, literacy, and many children are still employed in wage employment outside their own household. Now, these statistics are shocking enough, but in one sense, you might say that they are still beautifying the situation a little. And the reason for that is that they are time slice statistics. So they look at the world at one moment in time and look at how the various people alive in that moment in time, how well off they are. If you look at the world that way, you are overweighting the importance of people whose lives are long and underweighting the importance of people whose lives are short. This diagram here shows that. You see here that because people in the top fifth of the world's population tend to live much longer than people in the bottom fifth, they are here overrepresented in the time slice statistic. So what this diagram shows is that about a third of all human lives are lived in the bottom fifth of the human population. Simply because the turnover there is faster, people live shorter lives, and so many more lives are lived there than among the more affluent people like ourselves, who are living for the most part in the top quintile, in the top fifth. So the time slice view, the snapshot view, is in a way even understating the magnitude of the problem. But here's a statistic that weights each human life equally, no matter how long or short it is, namely a statistic about how people die. And you see here that about a third of all human deaths are from poverty-related causes. And I can also show you what these causes are. 18 out of 57 million a year, roughly. And this is a conservative statistic in the following sense. I've taken those causes of death that are basically unknown among richer populations, completely ignored other deaths that may also be premature, but from causes that are also present among the rich. Poor people die from the same things we die from: diabetes, cancer, heart disease, and so on, and often much sooner because they have more environmental burdens and lousy medical care for the most part. But I've not counted any of those deaths among the ones here listed. I've only counted those causes of death which are pretty much wholly absent from richer countries like ours. Now, if you put that in perspective, 18 million a year dying from poverty-related causes, you see that this is a very large number. Since the end of the Cold War, about 400 million people died from poverty-related causes, conservatively estimated. And that's twice as many as died from government-sponsored violence in the entire 20th century. All the wars, all the civil wars, the gulags, the concentration camps, Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, all included, killed about 200 million people in a century. Poverty kills twice as many in just 22 years. Now that puts in question our commitment to human rights, and in particular to the human right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of oneself and one's family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, necessary social services, and so on. We are committed to this. It's one of the official human rights in the Universal Declaration, also spelled out in the covenants, but it's certainly also the by far least realized human right of all. It's the most underfulfilled human right of all. Now, when you ask yourself, why is it? Why is it in a world that we are all led to believe is actually quite affluent now? The average income in the world is around $10,000 now per person per year. Why is it that in a world that is successful economically and technologically, so many people are still so deprived? The superficial answer is very easy to give. It is that income is very unequally distributed. There are huge disparities in income, and I want to show you what they are. This is the top 5% of the world's population, their share of global income. It's about 46%. An equal share goes to the next 20%. So now we have the top quarter on the board, and they together have over 90% of world income. And you can see the second quarter takes away the large majority of what remains. The third quarter, and finally, for those of you in the back, this is hard to see, but the bottom quarter, the poorest quarter of the world's population, had, as of 2005, the last year for which we have fully adequate statistics, had about 0.78 or 0.75% of world income. So we have in aggregate enough, the world is rich enough in aggregate, but the way it's distributed means that people in the bottom quarter have only a tiny, tiny fraction of the average income. Now, of course, that's only a very superficial explanation, because you will immediately ask me, so why is it then that income inequality has become so large? Why is it so extreme and remains so extreme? I think a very important part of the explanation, certainly for the last 20 years or so, 30, is regulatory capture. Regulatory capture is something that you understand well in a national context. We all know that rich people, rich corporations and banks lobby politicians, and they lobby politicians because they want regulations to be written and applied in ways that are favorable to themselves. So they consider this an investment. They invest in lobbying because the returns from lobbying are actually quite positive. There was a recent study actually showing that of the S&P 500 companies the 50 that spent most money on lobbying relative to their earnings actually had much greater success in terms of their stock market price than the other 450 that expended less money on lobbying, relatively speaking. So it's a familiar phenomenon, especially familiar now that we've just had election season behind us. But it is something that also affects the supranational level, or so I want to say. So regulatory capture, the phenomenon is that rules are known to have distributive effects. Tax rates, for example, but many other rules and regulations influence the way the social product gets distributed. And so everybody has an interest in the rules being shaped so that their shares become larger. But not everybody finds it in their interest to spend money on lobbying. Those who are richer find it easier. They have greater incentives to lobby and greater experience with lobbying, and also find it more rewarding to lobby because for them much more is at stake. So if I were to lobby, for example, to get a favorable tax rate for philosophy professors, it would be, very hard to imagine that I could invest significant amounts of money and still come out ahead. What I could do, of course, is I could try to organize 100,000 or however many philosophy professors there are, 10,000 probably, and try to form an alliance of lobbyists to try to get the tax rates for philosophy professors down. But again, that would cost a lot of effort and a lot of money to reach all the other philosophy professors, to convince them of the case and so on and so forth. On the other hand, if you're a hedge fund manager, one of the people who makes about $100 million a year, it is much easier to see that even one or two or a handful of hedge fund managers could easily get together and say, we're willing, each of us, to give a few $1,000,000 to get the tax rate on our income down. And that's, I think, related to the fact that we do have a special tax rate for hedge fund managers, which is 15%, which other people don't. Other people pay larger taxes than 15%. That gets put into the rules and gets renewed by the Congress because hedge fund managers are known to give a lot of money for political campaigns. So it's essentially lobbying, regulatory capture as a phenomenon that benefits those who are already advantaged and thereby leads to an inequality spiral, or at least potentially, where those already advantaged successfully invest in lobbying, thereby increase their own advantage and have in the next round even more resources to invest in lobbying. Now, the most cost-effective lobbying in the recent 20, 30 years or so was, I think, lobbying regarding supranational institutions. Supranational institutions have grown much more important in these years of globalization after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, because now much more of the interactions, economic and otherwise, in the world, not just transnational ones, but even national ones, purely national ones, are strongly impacted, shaped and conditioned by the rules that exist internationally. The World Trade Organization is a very important example. So we now have trade rules that reach deeply into the domestic lives and economies of national societies, and their formulation is extremely important for what happens on the ground economically. These supranational rules get decided upon by governments, not by all governments, by the most important governments who negotiate these rules. And of course, if you can influence these important governments in their rule-shaping negotiations, then you can, again, have an opportunity to lobby, invest in lobbying in a way that is very lucrative. It's especially lucrative because at the supranational level, you don't have the kind of countervailing forces that you have nationally. Nationally, any law that is to pass the Congress will be published. It will be known before it gets passed, and people can weigh in. If they don't like the law, they can write to their Congress people, they can write about it in the newspaper, on blogs, and so on. But at the international level, we don't have that kind of transparency because negotiations happen behind closed doors and treaty texts get published only after they've been adopted. Even once they get published, it's very difficult to find out why particular language is in the document. Often you cannot find out who insisted on certain paragraphs, who insisted on certain language, how the bargaining took place. You just see the result. And that again undermines accountability. It's very easy to push for something and nevertheless remain anonymous, not to be known to have pushed for it, not to have known to have worked towards it. And that sort of secrecy, these negotiations, that's an ideal environment for lobbying, where politicians can give favors to people who reward them without being held accountable by those who elect them. And that's, I think, what explains in part this massive push upwards in the last 25 years or so from the national level to the supranational level, that this global or supranational architecture has sprung into existence pretty much overnight, very, very quickly in historical dimensions. The lobbying, once again, is done by the very wealthiest banks, corporations, industry associations, and individuals. And the US, of course, plays a key role for two reasons. The US, on the one hand, is a country in which lobbying is very successful. It's very open to lobbying. In many other advanced democratic countries, elections are funded publicly, for example, on the basis of how many votes a particular party got in the last 4 or 5 elections averaged, rather than by private individuals and corporations. And the United States is also still the big kid on the block. It's the strongest, most powerful negotiating partner in these supranational negotiations. So if you want to invest in supranational lobbying, you couldn't do better than invest in trying to influence the US negotiating stance on important supranational rules and regulations, including how they get applied. Now, there's a counter-argument to this explanation. I'm basically saying the inequality that is built up over the last 20, 25 years was built up through, in good part, supranational lobbying efforts, much of which went through influencing the US government. The counter-argument says, look, this can't be right because poverty has developed differently in different countries. So you have, over the last 25 years, some developing countries that did immensely well, like China in particular, and other developing countries that did very poorly, many African countries, for example. And they all existed in the same world, and so you can't really say that the aggravation of poverty is due to the structure of supranational rules, because after all, these different poor populations, or formerly poor populations, all were placed under the same supranational rules. And the argument is supposed to show then that it's local factors that explain why poverty persists where it persists and why poverty gets eradicated where it gets eradicated. Now, I've got two answers to that argument. One answer is more conceptual, and it says that the argument is simply a non sequitur. To make that argument easily followable, I'll present it in a very different context that is very familiar to you, namely in terms of the evaluation of teachers in a classroom. So I teach at a place called Yale, where the following happens. At the end of the semester, some people have learned a lot, and other people have learned very little. Doesn't happen here, of course. Everybody learns a lot. But at Yale, that happens. And so what I want you to conclude from that is that at Yale University, the quality of teachers is irrelevant to student success. It's irrelevant to student success because, as you can see, some students do very well and others do very poorly. They all had the same teacher. So the teacher's quality can't play any role, right? Okay. Obviously, that's an idiotic argument. So let's just say why it's an idiotic argument. It's an idiotic argument for at least 3 reasons. One is that if the teacher had been better or worse, then the learning success of all the students might have been better or worse, with the same differences remaining. Secondly, even the differences could be explained by the teacher. So the teacher selects certain materials and also a certain teaching style. Some teachers teach with a lot of numbers and pie charts and equations, and other teachers with a lot of long sentences and so forth. And so depending on the teaching style, some students may thrive under a certain teaching style with certain teaching materials, and other students under others. So even the differences among students in terms of their performance may well be explainable by reference to the way the teacher teaches. And thirdly, even a clearly student-specific factor, such as motivation, may be influenced by the teacher. So if a teacher cracks a lot of sexist jokes, that may turn off the female members of the audience who say, look, you know, if he's such a dinosaur with regard to women in academia, then maybe he's not worth listening to in the first place. And so they become demotivated. And again, differences in student performance are again explained by the teacher. So all this is trivial, it's meant to be trivial, but it's just supposed to warm you up for the corresponding idea that the global rules, the way our global institutions are structured, can play a very important role in explaining both the overall trajectory of poverty and also the differential success across countries. That, for example, China did a lot better in terms of poverty eradication than other countries. It did better because the rules were more tailor-made for China than they were for resource-rich African countries, for example. And that's exactly what I'm claiming. Now let me give some evidence in favor of the view that the shape and design of global institutional arrangements did play an important role. Here you see inequality in the United States. This is relevant because I claimed that the United States would be the most important agent that you want to lobby in order to improve your prospects under supranational rules. And that would suggest that those countries or those companies and banks and so on that are in a particularly good position to lobby the US government should have made out particularly well in the globalization period. And that's what we actually find. We find that the globalization period was one of massive increases in income inequality in the United States. And these income inequality increases were especially concentrated among the very, very top of US taxpayers. This is all data from the Internal Revenue Service. So you can see here that the top 100th of 1% of the US population, 30,000 taxpayers, 14,000 tax returns, have increased their share of national household income roughly sevenfold since 1978. So a fantastic increase, which of course went at the expense of the bottom half. This is also interesting because many of you have learned in Econ 101 that inequality in a country as it matures first rises and then falls off again as the country is fully industrialized. That's the so-called Kuznets curve. And the Kuznets curve has proved dramatically correct in the US. Income inequality increased to 1928, decreased to 1978, but then it violated the Kuznets curve and went right back up to 1928 levels where we are now, with extremely high income inequality. So what are some of the supranational factors that drive rising income inequality? I think here are a few that I've analyzed in some more detail. I'll just quickly go through them so that you know what they are. One is that the grand market opening of the WTO agreement has still left in place a number of protectionist mechanisms in the rich countries, in the US, in Europe, and also in Japan, especially in agriculture and textiles, which allow us, for example, to subsidize our exports of cotton. The Europeans to subsidize their exports of sugar and dairy products and so on. And these subsidies work against farmers in the developing countries who, if markets were really free, would be much more competitive in world markets, could export much more of their stuff. Pollution rules are notable mainly by their absence. Most of the benefits of pollution go to the rich societies that pollute much more on a per capita basis than the poor, but much of the vulnerability is concentrated among the poor, where already several 100,000 people per year die from global warming related catastrophes, natural disasters, and so on. Illicit financial flows, that's a very important topic, very much unknown by the majority of the population. About 15% of all global wealth sits in tax havens, where it's not even known who owns the stuff, and it's certainly not being taxed. And corporations avoid a great deal of taxes in developing countries simply by shuffling their profits into jurisdictions where taxes on profits are much lower. So you just saw a few days ago Apple and Google, where there were statistics in the press saying that they pay basically no taxes outside the United States, where most of their profits are, 1% maybe on average, 1.5%, and they manage that feat simply by arranging the trade among their subsidiaries in such a way that their profits are concentrated in low tax jurisdictions. Tax havens also are very negative in terms of allowing the proceeds from embezzlement to be brought to safety. So a lot of Chinese officials, for example, steal a lot of money and get bribed a lot, and they shuffle these profits into bank accounts in tax havens where these profits are safe. Chinese are not the only ones. It happens pretty much in all the developing countries that there are substantial outflows that are enabled and facilitated by the fact that they are welcome, these monies are welcome in Western banking systems, not just tax havens, but also in the US and the UK, City of London in particular. The four privileges, that's the phenomenon that we recognize people who govern a country based on purely power alone as entitled to sell the resources of the country and to borrow money in the name of the people of the country. And that, again, is a phenomenon that leads to tremendous outflows. The people in these countries lose their natural resources. They get sold off by the government. And they get loaded up with debts, again, thanks to their government, even though the government may well have come to power through a coup d'etat and may govern completely undemocratically and, of course, corruptly. Again, global rules about recognizing governments on the basis of power alone facilitate these sorts of phenomena, these sorts of large outflows. Pharmaceuticals, again, the TRIPS agreement in the mid-1990s, part of the World Trade Organization agreement, has instituted intellectual property rights, a one-size-fits-all system, which requires all WTO members to award patents on pharmaceuticals and thereby allow pharmaceutical companies to charge very high prices also in developing countries. That means that poor people lack access to essential medicines over the vast majority of the people in the developing countries, and again aggravates poverty and increases inequality. So these are some examples that have contributed to the increase in inequality over these years. This increase I'm now going to show you by wiggling the next two slides back and forth. This is the period of 1988 to 2005, and you can just see how the world income distribution has changed during this period. It's not, maybe visually speaking, a very massive change, but still, for a period of just 17 years, gaining 3.5% of global household income for the top 5%, that's a pretty significant achievement. And I would also ask you to notice what happened to the bottom quarter. The bottom quarter suffered a significant loss of roughly a third of its share of global household income, going from 1.16% down to the 0.78% that I showed you earlier. So the key facts about this development, these 17 years, are that the top 5% have gained 3.5% of global household income, that the ratio between them and the bottom half in average income has exploded from 185 to 1 to 297 to 1, that if the poorer half had held steady, had just maintained its share of global household income, they would now be 21% richer, and the bottom quarter even 49% richer if they had maintained their share. And if the 3.5% that was in fact gained by the top 5%, if that had gone to the bottom half, poverty would already be history. The very same shift, not in favor of the top 5%, but in favor of the bottom half, would have doubled the share of the bottom half from 3.5% to 7%, and essentially wiped out poverty altogether, at least the kind of extreme poverty that I showed you at the beginning. So again, that reminds us of a very important human right in our catalog of human rights in the Universal Declaration, namely that everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. What I'm saying is, insofar as the persistence of severe poverty in very, very large numbers is due to the way we have shaped our international institutional order, we share some responsibility for that persistence of poverty. Because we are, after all, citizens of the most important country in the world that has a very important role in shaping these rules. And if these rules are shaped by and for the rich, essentially, and thereby deprive the poor of a fair share of global household income, then that responsibility is not just the responsibility of the rich people who lobby, but also the responsibility of us as citizens and voters, who, after all, own the actions of our government. So this is then the train of responsibility. The explanation of the persistence of world poverty leads me to an assignment of responsibility to us as citizens, that we are at least in part responsible for as much poverty remaining as there now remains. I think there are two citizens' responsibilities forward-looking that follow from that. The first one is that we should work politically to try to stem the influence of the great lobbies in favor of trying to make the institutional rules of our world more poverty-friendly, more friendly towards the eradication of poverty. And secondly, that we should also try to compensate some for the ill effects of the existing institutional order by taking effective measures, for example, through NGOs and effective aid organizations, to protect poor people from the harms that we are also partly responsible for producing. And I want to say in conclusion a little bit about how one might do these two tasks. And I do that by introducing you to an organization that is now about 1.5 years old, called ASAP, or Academics Stand Against Poverty. It was started by a bunch of philosophers, but is now, I'm happy to say, including a lot of people from other fields, political science, economics, public health, and so on, law. And we are working together to create a platform that allows academics to work together internationally and interdisciplinarily towards making a difference to poverty. The reasons why we founded this organization are the following. First, we say, often people say, well, academics should just stay in the academy. They should do their nice research. They should not get involved in the ways of the world. That kind of violates a little bit their perceived neutrality and standoffishness from day-to-day political affairs. But here, our counter-argument is to say that academics are already massively involved in politics, You find lots of academics writing on the pages of The Economist magazine, for example, defending the benefits of globalization and so forth. And of course, the lobbyists who are spending a lot of money lobbying government officials are also spending some money on lobbying academics or bringing academic experts to bear in their lobbying efforts. So we see ourselves mainly as just countering the considerable influence that academics are already expending on defending the status quo, defending globalization as it has been practiced in the last so many years. Secondly, academics are needed because nobody else is really speaking for the poor. In these international negotiations, the voices of the poor are completely absent. And that, I think, is something that needs to change. And academics can help at the very least by making clear what the impact of various pending decisions will be on poor people. That question is often not even asked. People consider, governments consider various options. They say we could write the treaty this way, or we could write it this way, and so on. But nobody really examines what the consequences of alternative ways of designing a treaty or agreement or convention are on the poor. How would the poor be affected? The third point is the urgency of the effort. I've already showed you the magnitude of the poverty problem, the avoidability. The world is plenty rich enough to wipe out poverty completely at this point. I showed you earlier, just a moment ago, that if the gain that in fact went to the top 5% had gone to the bottom half, they could now have 7%, and that would be enough. And the top half would still have 93% left over. So that shows you poverty is very easily eradicated, that severe poverty, and so it's really urgent to do it, also in light of the fact that we are not just innocent bystanders, but that at least our government, which we own in a sense, is an important player in designing the rules that are keeping the poor down. Fourthly, there's the ideal role of educators in society, that educators have a special responsibility, I think, to speak up when important things happen in their society. Another example of that is climate change. I think educators have a very important task to alert the population that this is really happening. It's really important. And we have to do something now if we want to avoid catastrophic climate change in the next 100 years or so. And last but not least, academics have special capacities. They have capacities for description, explanation, assessment, and reform. And they also have a good bit of creativity that helps in thinking about solutions. What could we do differently? What haven't the politicians thought of that we could do differently in a way that would maybe protect the poor without putting excessive burdens even on the rich or on the middle classes of the rich countries. So what is ASAP? It's can be described in 3 words: collaboration, outreach, and impact. Collaboration means that we are trying to get academics together to work across countries and disciplines. Outreach means that we want these academic research results to be disseminated, that we want people to understand and to know and to understand better what really goes on in our world. And impact means that we measure our success or failure by the difference that we can make to poverty on the ground. What do we do here? Some examples of projects that are currently ASAP projects that we undertake. Know Your Rights India is the effort to create a website that would allow Indian citizens who have a lot of rights but very few fulfilled rights to know what their rights are, to know how they can claim them and protest any obstacles or obstructions in their efforts to claim them, and in particular which NGOs might help them get access to their rights and entitlements. We have a project on moral psychology and poverty alleviation, thinking about what makes it so easy for many people in the developed world to ignore the problem of global poverty and its easy eradicability. Why do so few people care about a problem that is so much bigger even than the Second World War in terms of the harm that it does. We are heavily involved in the Beyond 2015 effort. You all know what the MDGs are, right? The Millennium Development Goals. They were adopted in 2000, they're expiring in 2015, and there's now a major move afoot among politicians to postulate new goals, what the world should achieve in the 15 years following 2015. There's a big consultation going on right this year, actually in the period between last summer and the next summer, and many NGOs are trying to weigh in, are trying to argue for certain kinds of goals to be adopted, and we see ourselves as the intellectual arm of that enterprise in that we get lots and lots of academics involved who can deliver facts and explanations and data that help NGOs effectively make their arguments to the people in power. I think they didn't, when they talked about having a big consultation and so on, they didn't quite expect that we would take it seriously and weigh in as heavily as we have been doing with proposals and data and objections to their ideas. The Health Impact Fund, finally, is an institutional reform project that would allow pharmaceutical innovators to get rewarded on the basis of the health impact of a new medicine if they agree to sell it at cost. So here the idea is that pharmaceutical innovators currently, they can only be making money in one way, by using their patent power to mark up the price of the product and then sell it at often 30, 40, 50 times the cost of production. We want to give pharmaceutical companies a second opportunity to make money by being rewarded on the basis of impact if they charge a low price. This would in particular motivate pharmaceutical companies to develop medicines for the diseases of the poor. Poor people cannot pay large markups, and so their diseases often go unresearched. The Health Impact Fund would change that. So here the idea is to collect from all the countries in the world a very tiny fraction of their gross national product, 0.01%. That would amount to something like $6 billion a year, and these $6 billion each year would be paid out to innovators who are willing to sell a new medicine they invented at cost. Each medicine would stay on the fund for 10 years, get 10 years worth of reward on the basis of measured health impact, and then the medicine would go generic, just like medicines go generic under the conventional patent system. That gets me to the last point, the Millennium Development Goals, where I think in some ways a success. They focused a lot of attention on deprivations and poverty, but they were also in other ways a failure, in particular because they were formulated in a way that remained completely anonymous or detached from particular agents. The goals were goals like poverty should be halved, infant mortality should be reduced by blah, blah, blah %, and so on. And of course, everybody can easily agree to that. These are wonderful goals. Sure, it would be great if poverty were halved. The problem is that no particular agent felt responsible. Everybody was a bystander to this wonderful wish list. Everybody was cheering on the goals and saying, yeah, I hope they will be fulfilled. But nobody can be held accountable. It can be said of nobody afterwards if these goals don't get fulfilled, and some of them certainly won't be. Nobody can be held to account and be told, look, you didn't do what you should have been doing. You didn't do your task, your share of the work. And so what we need to do is move from detached goals to agreed responsibilities where specific agents, such as governments, undertake specific concrete responsibilities, and we see these responsibilities as best formulated as reform goals, as trying to change some of the supranational rule structures that are now working against the emancipation of the poor. So this is not official development assistance. official development assistance gets a lot of attention. Whenever people talk about poverty, immediately people say, well, maybe we should give more development assistance. But that's not my message. My message is that we should take our eyes off development assistance, which is but a very small slice of the big global institutional architecture, and we should focus on those other 99.8% of the big global institutional architecture, which often works against the poor. So rather than counteract the harmful effects of global institutional arrangements upon the poor by increasing either the amount or the effectiveness of development aid, what we should do is try to switch off or reduce the headwind that these other institutional arrangements blow into the faces of the poor. And that's where we get the idea of institutional reform goals. And I will just conclude with this slide to show you examples of what one might do in the institutional reform goal arena. So with regard to protectionist subsidies, one might say, okay, if the Swiss want to have an agriculture, they want their mountains to be beautified by cows that are grazing there and dairy industry, that's understandable. So let them subsidize their dairy industry. But if they do it, let them also pay a little bit of money into a pool that makes it up to the global poor who are losing export opportunities because of these protectionist measures. Greenhouse gas emissions, again, we can't avoid them altogether, but at least let's make it up to poor populations who suffer the effects by having a little tax or a little fee imposed on greenhouse gas emissions for the benefit of those who don't benefit from them but suffer their effects. Arms exports, another very harmful thing for poor people in poor countries, especially in Africa. Let there be a tax on arms exports so that at least some of the harmful effects can be compensated for. An alternative minimum tax on the profits of multinational corporations so that no matter how intelligently they reshuffle their profits, they will at least pay some taxes on those profits that would go into a global fund, again devoted to poverty eradication. End accounts with unknown owners. There's no reason in the whole wide world why somebody should be allowed to maintain a bank account where the bank doesn't know whose money that is. This is just a facilitation of crime of one sort or another, of embezzlement, of tax evasion, of drug dealing, of trafficking in human beings, of terrorism. And we really don't need such accounts anywhere in the world. If the big countries, the US, the UK, and so on, stopped the practice and leaned on the tax havens to stop the practice as well, we could eradicate all these anonymous accounts relatively quickly. Debt burdens, let only minimally representative rulers be entitled to indebt their countries. If dictators like Mobutu Sese Seko or Obiang or Sani Abacha, if they want to borrow money and somebody wants to lend it to them, that's fine with me, but don't let the country that these people are ruling dictatorially bear the responsibility for the debts. Let Citibank go to Sani Abacha or his heirs. Let's not have Citibank go to Nigeria to try to get its money back. So only reasonably representative governments that are, for example, elected by the people should have the power to borrow money in the name of the people of the country. Similarly, with natural resource purchases, it's probably unrealistic to say that natural resources should only be sold by reasonably democratically elected legitimate governments. Saudi Arabia comes to mind. This would be a big gap in our oil supply if we couldn't legally buy from the Saudi government. But at the very least, let's have a tax on natural resource purchases from unrepresentative governments, and let's spend that money on some of the poor populations who are here being deprived of their resources. And finally, let's work on trying to realize that option that I talked about with pharmaceuticals. Let there be the possibility for the development of new medicines and their distribution to be rewarded on the basis of actual health impact on condition that the medicine is sold at cost. That would divert a good bit of attention of pharmaceutical innovators to the diseases of the poor, which now all too often are neglected. And that's why they're called the neglected diseases, because very little research is being done on them. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Pogge, for coming here tonight. Welcome to KU. One, it seems that the globalization of capitalism is then preceded by the globalization of poverty, and that a lot of this problems and solutions are based on the capitalist model. I brought a bunch of anthropology students here tonight, and I think perhaps one of the questions that's going through their mind is how this relates to indigenous populations for whom income inequality is not the measure of poverty, and that instead it may be more the access to land, the access to their own health and well-being, and that one of the problems that seems to or one of the solutions that seems to be in front of them is if they play the capitalist game of, say, trademarking their indigenous knowledge and then selling it to pharmaceutical companies, they can have the income to preserve their land, but then now they're caught up in the system that problematizes it for everybody.
Yeah.
So,
Wonderful question. So let me start by saying I'm involved in a research project in Australia that is trying to develop new indices for measuring poverty. And we have done field work there. This was a major grant from the Australian government, and Oxfam also gave us a lot of support for this, and the International Women's Development Agency, because it measures both poverty and gender disparities. These are the two objectives. We've gone through 6 different very poor countries and found poor populations there, and actually discussed it in 3 different rounds of field work with them, in each country picking 1 urban, 1 rural, and 1 disadvantaged, especially marginalized population, most often an indigenous population. And so we've actually worked on this exactly, so we are quite familiar with these kinds of problems, that you don't necessarily want to get them into a capitalist mode of being, but of course they are threatened by capitalist expansion. Very often there are resource extraction companies coming into their space and driving them out in various ways and so on. And so they have to learn at the very least to function in the political system. I'm thinking of the Philippines in particular, where we had a pretty marginalized indigenous community that was heavily threatened by resource extraction companies, and had to learn to organize politically. It's a reasonably democratic country, but to form alliances, to form organizations, and then to weigh in on the political process is very, very difficult. With regard to the specific thing about intellectual property rights, I've been involved in that too with the Sun in South Africa, with the Hoodia plant, that whole, you probably know the case. And I agree with you that it is often alien to the culture of indigenous people to charge money, right? Yes, they did cultivate the Hoodia plant for all these generations, and they had the knowledge and so on, but their natural reaction to other people wanting it is to say, of course, have it, be my guest, why would we charge for this, why would we patent this? But on the other hand, they certainly don't want to and don't deserve to have it patented by somebody else who then charges them money to use, so to speak, their own plants. I see the Health Impact Fund project as a project that is, in one sense, of course, a compromise with capitalism, because you say, here is a way in which we can reward innovators, but also a way of rewarding them that is very different and much more congenial to the values of indigenous populations, and many of us, frankly, right? We all find it much more congenial if somebody is rewarded on the basis of the health impact that they achieve, rather than on the strength of often the shenanigans that people play with the patent system, that they find intelligent ways to extend their monopoly a little longer and then get paid exorbitant amounts of money because other people can't sell the same product that is very cheaply producible and so on. So I don't think that we can hope, globalization is here to stay for sure, and globalization is in many ways something very positive. It can be very positive. We can create a framework in which we can protect indigenous populations, in which we can fulfill the needs of poor people all over the world. But it has to be a different globalization. It has to be globalization under different rules, designed with some intelligence in order to achieve these objectives. And the globalization that we have had in this early push in the first 20, 25 years has set the switches in altogether the wrong direction. And I'm afraid that we are already quite behind the curve. So things are not going to be easier forward going, but rather harder by the fact that certain structures have already congealed and a lot of power has already been gained by the richest, most advantaged participants in the system.
Hi, thank you. How would you respond to a thinker like Aaron Hardin, who argues for a lifeboat ethics by which wealthy nations should insulate themselves against the poor planning, the overpopulation, and so forth of poorer nations, so as to, in a manner of speaking, teach them the lesson of good long-term planning and so forth? Thank you.
Yeah, good. And the first response there is to send him back. I mean, he died a long while ago, but to send him back to look at the facts. And I agree wholeheartedly that overpopulation is a massive problem, that we are ecologically in very big trouble, and the ecological trouble is a very simple mathematical function of two factors, namely the average footprint of a person in the world and the number of persons that there are. And so, if you want to do something about the footprint, we want to get both of those factors down. Now here's the good news, and there's not a lot of good news in this space, but one piece of good news is that poverty eradication has a tremendously powerful effect on the total fertility rate. Total fertility rate is the average number of children per woman, and we can see it both synchronically and diachronically. Total fertility rates have come down massively in the period since the 1950s, since we have really accurate measures of total fertility rates, massively in the countries in which poverty has been eradicated. About 100 countries now have total fertility rates below 2, which is the rate of reproduction. And these are all upper middle income and high income countries. Whereas the poorest countries like Niger, Senegal, and so on still have total fertility rates around 7. So very, very high, and in Africa in particular, populations are multiplying enormously. Now, this is something that teaches a very simple lesson. If we can eradicate poverty, the immediate effect will be exactly as Hardin predicts, namely that there will be an increase in population because the person who would otherwise have died is now alive, and maybe even gets kids after he would in the other world have died. But in the long run, even 40, 50 years ahead, certainly a century ahead, the effect is the exact opposite. If we want to get the human population back down to 7 billion, which is where it is now by the end of the century, we better do something about poverty, and rather quickly. So I think that's the main objection to Hardin's argument, which of course wasn't accessible to him at the time of his writing because he didn't know these facts, and these facts have emerged in the period since then.
I think we'll take one more question on that side. The line was a little longer.
Looking over the post-2015 reform goals, I don't quite understand how placing these taxes on companies and institutions would help eradicate poverty. Could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, they do it in two different ways. That's the nice thing about these ideas. They do it on the one hand on the revenue raising side, and on the other hand by raising revenues for poverty eradication. So I imagine that the funds raised in these ways would be put into global public goods like funding, where you would then, for example, support the Health Impact Fund, this fund that would incentivize the development of new medicines specifically for the diseases of the poor. That would obviously have a massive effect on poverty. And for various other anti-poverty measures that you could fund from that. But they would also have a positive effect on the revenue raising side by deterring or discouraging some of the activities that actually contribute to poverty. So if you have to pay a tax on any subsidies that you provide to your farmers, for example, you will presumably maybe reduce the amount of subsidies that you will pay to your farmers. That means less money gets raised, but it also means that there's going to be less of a distortion of world market prices that work against poor exporters from the developing world. So the US might say, well, if we have to pay extra, we will not subsidize our cotton industry as much as we have heretofore been doing, and that means that cotton farmers in Africa, Mali, and so on will have a better chance of getting good world market prices for their cotton, exporting their cotton into world markets.
Thank you very much for coming. I have a question regarding whether or not NGOs have a potential direct role in having their voices heard in the negotiations for international agreements like the WTO, and if they do not, how they can be most effective and where they can be most effective in influencing sovereign governments' opinions in that area.
Yeah, so I think historically speaking, the NGOs really slept through the WTO thing. The WTO thing it happened relatively quickly. It was sort of a sneak attack. The companies were very, very alert to it, and in particular the intellectual property rights thing. So the TRIPS agreement was something that came out of negotiations among 4 different industries, and you can guess what they are: pharmaceuticals, agribusinesses, software, and entertainment. And those industries sat together. They had different interests, but they found a way to agree. And then they went with their combined force to Washington and said, Bill Clinton, this is what you have to get for us out of the WTO. And 4 big industries, Clinton did what he was told to do and got that agreement for them. Where were the NGOs at that time? Nowhere to be seen. Everybody slept through it. And similarly with the MDGs. The last MDGs, was the NGOs were not in evidence and were confronted with the result like everybody else. But they have learned in the meantime, and a number of NGOs, in particular Oxfam, with which I work quite a bit, is an organization that on the one hand does a lot of work on the ground in the poor countries, but on the other hand also does a lot of educational work and work in the political arena. And so what ASAP is doing, for example, is working in a coalition of NGOs called Beyond 2015, about 400 NGOs at last count, and we want to work together and weigh in as a group. And I think we can make a significant difference. We have already made a significant difference in forcing, or at least pushing, for the kinds of consultations that are now going on. So what we have said, and it's pretty irresistible, is poor people have to have a say. You have to do consultations in India, in Brazil, in South Africa, so that you educate people about what you are trying to do and give them a chance to weigh in. It can't only be the big corporations and the big banks who have a seat at the table and know ahead of time what you're thinking about and get to weigh in. So I think we are beginning to turn the page on this one a little bit.
Thank you very much for the beautiful presentation. You mentioned about the income inequality in the world, but there were relative shares of different groups. How about absolute poverty? Is the globalization raising people out of absolute poverty? Is that helping? And I'm wondering if world economy is just one economy, Kutztown curve you mentioned within each country. But if you think world economy is just like one big country, one big economy, and the Kutztown curve says that the inequality is increasing while the economy is growing, and maybe it just reaches a peak at some point and then starts decreasing. Can you think of the Kutztown curve for the world economy in this case?
Yeah, so that's obviously it's possible that will automatically happen, but given my diagnosis of global institutional lobbying playing a major role, I'm not entirely optimistic, and I don't think we should simply have faith, blind faith, in it happening. So I think that the development of the global income distribution is driven in large part by these rules, and that these rules can be designed one way or the other. And so there's a political struggle between different ruling factions over what the rules should be. And depending on what the outcome of that struggle is, the income distribution develops one way or another. Now, the question of whether poverty has improved or has gone down is an extremely, extremely contested question with a lot at stake, because all the heavyweight big supporters of globalization, including the World Bank, corporations, politicians, they all have a huge stake in being able to say that poverty has improved. Now, I've analyzed to the umpteenth degree the World Bank's poverty numbers and found the methodology to be defective beyond belief. I mean, not just very sophisticated errors, but very big, blatant errors. That's in my book, Politics as Usual, so you can read it there. It would lead us too far afield to go through this in detail. One amusing tidbit from the last 2 weeks or so, the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, had been a great annoyance to the World Bank, because the World Bank showed poverty going down, 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 and the FAO was showing hunger going up, 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 up. So how can that be, right? Poverty is almost wiped out, but hunger is larger than it ever was. Over 1 billion in 2009 were said to be chronically undernourished. Well, guess what? 2 weeks ago, the FAO came out and said, well, actually, all our numbers were wrong. Actually, hunger has gone down all this time. And you know what? In 1990, there were 140 million more hungry people than we ever imagined. So now, 22 years later, the FAO is saying that actually the number of chronically undernourished people in 1990 was way higher than we ever. Then it was over 1 billion. And it's never touched 1 billion since. Now, you know, you and I know that things can be measured in different ways. You can measure poverty in different ways. You can, for example, have the $125 per person per day poverty line, which is the World Bank purchasing power parity adjusted, or you can use $2.50. If you use $1.25, you have a descending poverty trend according to the World Bank. If you use $2.50, well, nothing much has happened. It's been more or less flat. Go to the website POVCAL.net actually. Type it in, the World Bank, for any given poverty line that you enter, the World Bank will give you all the numbers. It's a wonderful website you can play with their methodology, their numbers. And you can see that you can, just at putting in different poverty lines, arrive at very different conclusions. The general fact is the lower the poverty line, the international poverty line, the better looking a trend you get. And that's why the World Bank, I dare say, is using this ridiculously low poverty line of $1.25 purchasing power parity. That means that you are not poor if you had more money per person per day in your household than what $1.25 could buy in the United States in 2005. Now, who can live of $1.25 in the US in 2005, right? It's an impossibly low poverty line. So in conclusion, let me say the most important thing in response to your question. And that is that the question which many people ask and which is constantly debated makes us look at the wrong thing. There's something much more important to look at. It's not that important whether poverty has in the last 20 years gone up or down. It is very, very important whether we have more poverty now than is really unavoidable. So think about somebody who's arguing for slavery in 1845, and that person says, look, I'm in favor of it. Look at the slavery system. Our black slaves, they are better fed, better clad, happier and healthier than they were in 1818. Nobody can deny that. And we are then supposed to roll over and say, okay, so then slavery is great? Of course not, right? What we will say is slavery is an abomination, even if it becomes less burdensome, there's less splitting of families, there's less raping of slaves, and so on and so forth. Even if it got better, it is still an abomination. And that's what I say about poverty. Poverty is totally avoidable. And yes, maybe it's been going down. I don't know. I certainly don't have confidence in the official numbers. I don't have the wherewithal to run surveys myself. But even if it's gone down, all of it as it exists now, or pretty much all of it, is entirely avoidable. And we have every reason to avoid it.
Right. Thank you very much in the first place. This is working. Yes. So I understand, for example, the last point, because I see an economic incentive for those pharmaceutical companies. But for example, with the taxes on arms exports, we were talking about the international system and the structure of the international system in the very beginning. And I see that the international system also allows for competition between those governments. For example, arms exporters like UK, US, Germany, right? So how would you respond to an argument of where would this lead to if there is no unilateral incentive to implement such a tax, right? No country is going to do it. So is this leading towards this utopian notion of the world government that you want to reach those goals at some point, or how would this be implemented institutionally?
Well, it would be implemented by agreement, right? You would say to the governments that assemble and say, what do we do for the next MDGs? What is our next phase? You say to them, well, this is one thing you should agree to. You should agree, all of you, by treaty, to accept a certain tax of arms exports, maybe one that gradually becomes larger as time goes by. And then the question is, are countries going to say yes to that, on the assumption that others are also saying yes, right? Some people might say, the Chinese or whoever might say that we are not going to do that. We are not in favor of this, we don't want this. And then negotiations will set in, and maybe an agreement can be reached, or maybe no agreement can be reached. But I imagine that if a treaty is signed, then the incentives to live up to the terms of the treaty are pretty high. It's not going to happen as a voluntary mechanism, right? So it has to be something where you have some sort of a treaty or commitment mechanism where it would become quite embarrassing for countries then to opt out, to first agree to it and then to opt out. Do I think it has a chance to be agreed upon? I don't think it has a big chance to be agreed upon. But that doesn't deter me from proposing it, because I think it's morally highly compelling, and it focuses attention on what I always want to focus attention on, that we are not bystanders in the misery of the poor people, but that we are actively contributing. All the weapons that we send into Africa, for example, and are very actively trying to sell to them, are weapons that do a huge amount of harm, for example, by allowing dictators to remain in power, by fueling civil wars, and so on and so forth. So even if it's unsuccessful, it would still be a good moral lesson.
Thank you.
We take maybe two more questions.
Hello. The question I have is, I always wondered, there's like millions of dollars, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's like millions of dollars from governments, from private institutions going to charitable things, to charitable organizations in Africa, for example. What I wonder about, or the question maybe leads to this lack of accountability you were talking about, is that the reason why all these monies never showed any like real effect on there, or what is really the reason why these millions of dollars have basically been like wasted?
Yeah, it is more than millions. It's a few trillion by now over the post-war period. It's a lot of money. But there are two things to be said here. The first thing is that development aid is running up a descending escalator. The descending escalator are the structural features that are working against the poor. So you can go, for example, you have no access to medicines. Medicines are very expensive. And that is a new thing, right? The intellectual property rights system as we now know it was instituted in the mid-1990s, and it came into force in the less developed countries in 2005, 1st of January. So India, for example, had to completely rewrite its entire patent legislation. With this one stroke of the pen, you have created an enormous amount of burden and harm for the poor, because any new medicine that comes into India after the 1st of January 2005 is going to be under this patent system where generic companies can't invent around. Now you get people who do something about it. So you get the Gates Foundation, the Global Fund, and so on. They're spending inordinate amounts of money trying to buy medicines, often expensive medicines, to make sure that poor people have some access. But this is what I mean by this descending escalator, right? They're working hard, but they're also working against this headwind of high prices for medicines. It would be much better to turn off the headwind or turn off the descending escalator or slow it down at least, for example, by something like the Health Impact Fund, where you have a structural reform that would make a certain portfolio of advanced and very effective medicines available at cost all over the world. And so that's one answer. The other answer is that, of course, all development aid, both public and private or NGO, is driven by our concerns in the rich countries. So if you give a development aid minister in a rich country a pot of money and say, spend this money on development aid so that we get credit in Paris, where the OECD is measuring how much development aid each country gives, then this guy is going to say, or the woman is going to say to herself, well, here I've got this pot of money, let me see whether I can do something useful with it. And the useful things you can do with it that's good for you, for your career, for your party, is that you try to make domestic companies benefit somehow. So you buy products at home and then export those to developing countries, right? Most aid is conditional in that way. Or you give it to some rulers in the developing world whom you want to keep sweet, who you want to vote for you, for example, for the next war against Iraq or whatever. You need votes in the United Nations, and so you say, okay, we'll give something to, or Mubarak got a lot of money from us, huge amounts of money. Why? Because he made peace with Israel. So for reasons like that, you give something and you declare it to be development aid. You can see that from the fact that development aid, which is about 120 billion per annum these days, about 15 billion of that goes for basic social services, which is basically poverty eradication, basic healthcare, basic education, and so on. All the rest goes for other stuff, and much of it for perfectly useless stuff. Now switch to the NGOs, right? The NGOs are mainly beholden to their donors. So they have to somehow win the hearts and minds of those who donate money. And that means that they have to always be like ambulance chasers. They have to go to where something is happening and make sure that they are the first on the ground, that they get on the evening news with something and so on. Very few NGOs really can work in the interstices, somewhere where poverty is endemic, and try to really make a difference. Right? You always have to cover the publicity side because your money will dry up if nobody knows what you're doing, if you don't have glossy magazines in which you can showcase what you're doing and so on. So again, that's driven by the needs more of the donors than of the recipients. Still, I think the first point remains valid. A lot of people, tens of thousands of good people, are doing very, very good work. And you would think that if so many good people do so much good work, then poverty should melt away. And that just goes to show how powerful these structural factors are. Without these good people, the problem would be even much worse. And so they are making a difference, but because they're running up a descending escalator, the difference doesn't really show up as much as we would like, because in objective space, these good people running up the escalator are essentially keeping us in place. Without them, the thing would go down even worse, and the poverty trend would be much worse looking.
One final question.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you for your very wonderful and informative lecture. And I was wondering, as we've seen with the governments of China and India and their people, as they've grown in their incomes, they've been using more and more of the world's resources, such as metal and lumber. If there are less people in the world who are who no longer under this poverty level, who will be now consuming, how can the world possibly sustain such a large amount of new consumers when we can barely hold the ones we have now?
Yeah, we can't, you're right. It will not be possible for the people in the developing world to have our standard of living. And so prices will go up, the strains on the environment will increase, and there will be a competition, a very severe competition over resources, which has already begun. For example, in the land grab business, right? There's a great deal of land purchases now going on in Africa and also Latin America, where, for example, Asian countries are buying up large tracts of land, the Koreans, the Chinese, and so on and so forth. So there is a significant resource scarcity looming, which is in part driven by precisely that phenomenon that you described, that people who are becoming a little wealthier in India and China want to have their own middle-class existence. You know, in China they all want a car. In India, grotesquely, this company Tata has now developed a car you can buy for $2,000, which is 1 lakh or 100,000 rupees. And so everybody and their aunt is now trying to get their hands on one of these little cars. And it would be so much nicer if they found an intelligent way of developing rather than imitating what we are doing. So something has to give here, and what will give will be decided, if present trends continue, by a kind of arm wrestling, by a kind of economic competition, where the oil and the resources and so on, scarce as they are and increasingly scarce, and water is another very, very important resource that will be scarce very soon, if it isn't already, where these resources will simply go to where the most is bid for them, and there could be very bad consequences. Now, one way of reading your question would be to say, look, let's not follow this prophet too fast, because he is going to tell us that we should recognize as equally entitled the people in the developing world, and once we do that, our own standard of living is in jeopardy. Right? Now, if that's your point, then my response would be to say, well, how fair is it just to say, because we want to maintain our standard of living where we consume 5 times as much as the average consumption that the world is capable of sustaining, how fair is it that we say to the other people, the majority on this planet, well, it's just too bad. You know, you can't have the bare essentials of a worthwhile human life because we just want to drive a pickup truck or an SUV or whatever it is. You know, we want to have the... So we have to recognize that these are human beings who are equally entitled with us to share the resources of this planet, and we have to find a way of living relatively quickly, I hope, that will allow the world to live within their means. Here we can rely on the good news that I gave earlier about total fertility rates, that if we eradicate poverty relatively quickly, we'll have a much more favorable number of people in the world by the year 2100 than would otherwise be the case. But we also have to do a good bit of belt tightening, I think, and especially with regard to resource-intensive things like using a lot of gasoline and so on. Here things are now going in quite the wrong direction. Now with fracking and so on, people say by 2017 the US is going to be energy independent, and so forget about everything you read about selling your SUV in favor of a Prius. No longer necessary. Stick with your SUV and consume and so on. We've got a few extra years of oil, and we should conserve now. We should try to reduce our consumption. We should not eat as much meat as we've been eating. Beef, for example, takes 8 times as many calories to produce as it delivers to human nutrition. And so rather than teaching the Indians how to eat meat, we should learn from the Indians how to eat good vegetables and live longer, healthier lives.
Right. Please join me in thanking